Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. This show is brought to you in partnership with the Witherslack Group, experts in special education and care. Enjoy the podcast.
Hello. I think that we are live.
We are. You're coming through loud and clear.
Fantastic. Amazing. So my name is Reem. This is the first show that I'm hosting with Teachers Talk Radio. So I'm really excited to get started. Just before we get started, whilst we're sort of thinking about other people that might be joining us as well, I'm just going to briefly introduce myself as it's my first show. So my name is Reem Ibrahim. I am a student at the London School of Economics. I am also a part-time 11 plus teacher, and you'll find out more about that as I discuss today's topic. And today we're going to be talking about the primary question that we were thinking about under the Liz Truss administration, which is, should we end the ban on new grammar schools? This was sort of the primary question around education policy during the very short-lived 44 days that Liz Truss was Prime Minister. And it's a topic that is quite close to my heart, purely due to the fact that I think that when we're thinking about education policy and we're thinking about social mobility, selective education is the best way to get to that. I mean, we've had some of our best prime ministers who have gone to grammar schools themselves. So Margaret Thatcher, for example, and Edward Heath, Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, some of which are Labour prime ministers, some Conservative, and they've gone to grammar schools and it's done them quite well. Today I have joining me Sabia Dean, who I think he can request to speak. If you just click on the bottom. Oh, and now your speaker, fantastic. So Sabi is the director of Think Smart Academy, and I'm very happy to have him joining me today, because Sabi, how long have you been teaching the 11 plus for? How long have you been teaching the exam?
Well, good evening to you, Reem. Thank you for having me. Delighted to be on the show with you.
Thank you for coming on.
My pleasure. Sorry. Okay, so I've been in teaching for about 10 years now. And obviously I started off as a part-time tutor, where our company would be teaching all the way from 11 plus up to A level. So it's only 5 years ago when I took over and became the director of the company. And from that, it's been a very pleasant journey, and we changed the name, brought about a lot of changes to our company. And yes, now we've got another branch opened up in High Wycombe. So yeah, it's been a very fantastic journey so far, and we're looking to go further and further out.
That's fantastic. I think it's really interesting because most of the other Teachers Talk Radio hosts are full-time teachers or have worked in full-time education in this sort of mainstream education system in the UK. But what's something slightly different, I think, that we maybe don't talk about as much, is this sort of third sector of education. So these not necessarily private schools, but we're thinking about these private tuition centres or these sort of private companies that administer exams like the 11 plus, which is obviously the selective exam to get into grammar schools. So I think what's interesting is that we don't hear too much about these different institutions and companies and organisations, but actually they have such a huge impact on our children's education. And a lot of them, I think, sort of people see them as purely just a sort of avenue for sort of middle class families to get their children to have extra tuition. Yeah. But actually a lot of these students come from a variety of different backgrounds. So Sabi, I was just wondering, so what sort of the different aspects of the teaching that the company you own administers, what sort of different stuff do you guys actually cover? Is it just the 11 plus exam, or do you cover other stuff as well?
No, so we start students as early as year 4, so that's obviously Key Stage 2, and we have 2 programs which run for Key Stage 2 students starting from year 4. Either the parents come to us because of where we're based in Slough, This was our first branch. Now the second branch is in High Wycombe. So now where we're based, we're surrounded by grammar schools. So all of the parents that come to us, majority of them, they do want to prepare their kids for the 11 plus. So we've got two programs. One is the 11 plus program, which we offer starting from year 4, and the other is normal tuition, just to get their kids, get the children, up to the level that they should be according to the national curriculum. Now, obviously, when they come on, we always do an assessment. Now that is
Oh, I think the didn't hear it cut off there. But I think it was
sorry.
interesting. Oh, go on then.
Yes. So what we do is obviously we take the assessment to begin with. Now that assessment allows us to determine whether or not this child may be eligible to sit the 11 plus, because we have to bear in mind it is an above average exam. Not every child is capable of passing it. So once we do the assessment, and if the result does determine that yes, this kid should be able to do the 11 plus, may be able to pass it, then we put them through our year 4 and year 5 program, which is a 2-year program, and prepare them for the 11 plus, which takes place at the beginning of year 6. Coming back to your question, we do offer tuition all the way up to A level. So we cover GCSE and we cover A level.
That's really interesting. So just focusing on the 11 plus exam now, before we get into sort of the wider question about grammar school government policy, I also teach the 11 plus, and I'm just wondering if you could explain to us a little bit about what actually goes into the 11 plus exam. What are the sort of stuff that a student might expect to see in the exam, and what sort of things are they being taught at Think Smart Academy or other tuition centres that cover the 11 plus? What sort of subjects are there, and what are they actually being taught?
Yes, of course. So the 11 plus 11 plus consists of 4 subjects. Number 1 is English, and then we've got number 2, verbal reasoning, maths, which is the third one, and then lastly we've got non-verbal reasoning. Now each of these subjects tests different abilities of the student. Starting with English, this is based around comprehension. So you have a comprehension extract where there's a short story and the child is asked about, what sort of things, what happens in the story, So it's a 20 mark, 15 to 20 question multiple choice tests around that short story that they give you. The second one is verbal reasoning. This consists of a lot of vocabulary. So you've got antonyms, synonyms, where the question may ask, circle the word on the right, which is an antonym of the word on the left, or a synonym. So this requires the child to do a lot of reading. So it is tough vocabulary, and at the same time, the child must be, throughout the course of the 11 plus, we do regular vocabulary tests. We always follow the parents up, ask them, what book are they reading? We give them recommended reading lists. And then third, we've got maths. In maths, you've got around about 35 to 40 topics which the students need to know. Now, in those 35 to 40 topics, they start off from year 4, year 5 level. So these are the maths topics that you need to know at the national curriculum. And then they go on to tougher topics such as algebra, ratio, which are topics you don't normally learn in year 5 or year 6. So for this, a child does require tuition, because if you follow the national curriculum for school, whatever you're learning in schools, you won't be able to cover those topics and it won't be sufficient for the exam. Lastly, you've got non-verbal reasoning. This is the most different out of the 3. Now, for non-verbal, it's also referred to as logical reasoning, where a child is asked to look at patterns and draw different links between them. So you may have an exercise which says, right, so carry on the pattern from these 4 shapes, or which is the missing shape in this pattern. Another one would be, which is the odd one out, similar shapes. So this test is actually quite challenging, because if as you may know, for a lot of job interviews, you get asked these sort of questions. This comes under logical reasoning.
This sort of like IQ test
IQ,
kind
exactly.
of questions, yeah.
It's not something which is actually taught in the curriculum at any stage, whether it be Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, GCSE or A level. This is something which you have to get the child accustomed to. So for that, you do need tuition. This is the shortest part of the exam. 25% of the exam consists of non-verbal. but obviously it's quite challenging, and bear in mind you've got a time frame which you need to do it in.
That's really interesting. So I think that the sort of non-verbal reasoning aspect of it, because it is based on logical reasoning, the amount that tuition or teaching actually has an effect on their score in terms of the non-verbal reasoning, I think is actually quite small. Because I found this with some of my students, that actually the non-verbal reasoning part of it, the probably about an hour or 2 hours of teaching can affect the sort of result that they get at the end of the test. But actually, past that, there isn't much of a difference, because it's primarily based on your IQ. And to me, that is sort of where the 11 plus exam is actually quite fantastic. And I think that's where most of the merits are, is, where the 11 plus actually is just based on natural IQ or natural intelligence. And I remember being in school, and we were sort of spoke about the growth mindset versus the fixed mindset. And we sort of had, I remember my teachers always having this conversation with us about the fact that natural intelligence is completely sort of, there's no evidence behind natural intelligence, that actually every child has the same kind of capacity. And I think that's just not sort of looking at reality. I mean, the reality is different children have different capabilities and also different strengths. I mean, a lot of our students tend to be very, very, very skilled at grammar and sort of language. They grasp the meaning of words very, very quickly.
Yeah, sorry, can I just interrupt there?
Yeah.
When you say something, whenever you're teaching the children, some may be good at vocabulary or some may not be that good at, vocabulary. I find it really depends on what sort of, effort the parents have been putting in with their child at home. Because some students that come to us, they're brilliant. You give them a vocabulary test and it's far beyond their level for year 4 or year 5. And that, I often find, is down to the parents, getting their children into a good routine at home, making sure when they come home, they go to the library, they pick up books. So I kind of disagree that it's all natural and it, we don't sort of have any, a lot of control over it. It really depends on their upbringing. And I find that parents which are more on the ball with this, their children tend to be a lot more, academically brighter.
Yeah, well, I guess this is the sort of nature versus nurture argument around
Yeah.
things like the 11 plus exam, which effectively are intended to test somebody's intelligence, like natural intelligence. There are a multitude of different studies that sort of go into whether or not children are, or humans in general are, have different like natural capacities, which, I mean, I think that's absolutely true. I think that some children have a natural capacity for certain subjects, or for certain sort of they just have different capabilities. And I think that that's certainly true when it comes to children. Some children potentially have different special educational needs that mean they do tend to be more sort of naturally catered towards specific subjects. But I think so. Do you think, Sabi, that the 11 plus exam is an equalizer then, in terms of the children that are sort of maybe from lower income families, those children that aren't their families definitely cannot afford a private education, they cannot afford to go to private schools, they cannot afford to go to any fee paying schools at all? Do you think that the 11 plus exam does act as an equalizer for those parents that can't afford it, or actually is it just a game where middle class families throw the kitchen sink at tuition for their children, and then they end up at grammar schools, and then you've got state schools that are left with all the children that couldn't afford it?
No, I mean, what I don't believe that it's only for the middle class or students or for the parents that can't really afford to put their kids through private education. Reason being is, speaking from experience, a lot of parents that have come to me from wealthier backgrounds, they actually want their children to do the 11 plus and actually work hard to get into the school and make sure that they want their child to feel like they deserve to be there. I mean, let's say if a child comes from a wealthy background and they have the money to put their child through, if the parent has a child, if the parent has the money to put their child through a private education, I think that's a bit, it's kind of like an easy route, because we know that the private schools, they are of a lot higher standard. So it's like saying someone has the money to afford to put their child through, private education, then obviously they're lucky. If they don't, then they're not so lucky. I don't agree with that, because a lot of the wealthier parents have come to me over the years, and they said, look, we actually want our child to appreciate, when they get into a good school such as a grammar school, we want them to, appreciate that they've had to work for a couple of years, put in a lot of effort, and then get to where they are, rather than just walking into a private school and getting a lot more benefits than you would do at normal state schools. So yeah, it is a mixture. It is a mixture, I have to say.
That's really interesting. That's one thing I've actually never really thought about, is the because we normally, when we're having these conversations about grammar schools, we usually talk about the impact it has on children from lower income families who end up having the opportunity to go to these schools that are selective, and then they are sort of exposed to a high level of education from an earlier age than their peers that are at, say, a state comprehensive school. I've never really thought about parents who actually can already afford private education but would like their children to feel as though they've earned their place at that school based on academic merit rather than purely just they come from a rich family. I think that's
Of course,
interesting. I've never
yeah, definitely, Reem. Yeah, no, I agree. It's that's one of the ways to look at it, because at the end of the day, you got to bear in mind. I mean, if it was myself, like, if I had to work hard to get to where I was, I'd like my child to also realize that there's no substitute for hard work and effort. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to the child's attitude throughout, towards learning, and their motivation, and what you obviously, you know what you teach them at home as well. Because we've seen, I mean, coming from a grammar school myself over the years, and whilst I've been teaching for the last 10 years, I've seen, kids with very average ability go on to achieve exceptional results at the end. They're going to achieve exceptional things, going to go into, amazing careers. And I've seen a lot of kids, a lot of children that have come to me over the years. They're, naturally so talented, above average, exceeding in every field, yet they're going to achieve very average results. It all comes down to attitude. So that's why it's
I
very
definitely think
important.
that's true. I guess in terms of them continuing that work ethic post
Yeah,
secondary school, because I mean, I guess between the two of us, we've got the two different educational experiences. I went to a regular state comprehensive school in I was about to say where I live then, in northwest London, and if anyone's seen any of my tweets, they can probably figure it out. But it was a regular state comprehensive school, and you went to a grammar school, and I think there's an interesting difference there, because a lot of my peers that ended up going to grammar schools, a lot of their parents actually moved house to go to grammar schools, because in where I
yeah,
live there are
yeah,
hardly any. I don't think there's any at all near where I live. But I did the 11 plus exam. My parents wanted me to do the exam just so that I had the experience of sort of revising and studying and looking at revision notes and all that stuff. I had that experience in year 5. So when I think I was 10 years old when I did the 11 plus exam, and it meant that when I went into secondary school, I already had that mindset, where I need to be taking notes, I need to be understanding the content throughout the year, because I learned when I did the 11 plus that there's a lot of content that we've got to learn. And I think it meant that actually in my secondary school, so yeah, during my time at secondary school, I already sort of saw myself as a high achiever, even if that wasn't the case. I mean, I remember being in primary school. Actually, this is quite funny. When I was in year 2, I was in sort of the lowest set of. We had like different tables. My primary school was very small. We had different tables, and when I was in primary school, I was on the lowest set. And I remember my teachers had to give me a foundation sheet before I did the sort of task that everybody else did, because I was just really thick. So the irony is that, like 15 years later, I came out with 2 A stars and an A level. I think maybe that does show that education has a huge impact, and maybe there isn't that natural capacity to learn. Actually, maybe a lot of us have very similar capacities, and it does depend on the environment, and it does depend on sort of the wider education system that we have. So Sabi, I'm going to ask you the ultimate question. Do you think that we should end the ban on new grammar schools? Do you think that grammar schools are a force for good in the British education system?
No, definitely. I think we should end the ban on grammar school. I believe that there should be a lot more. Like you said, just exactly what you said. That a lot of parents, they move their houses and they move into different areas just so that they can come under the catchment area, and that's happened to me so many times. That happened to me last week, even a couple of days ago, where the parent came to us for a consultation, and they said, "Look, we live towards, I believe it was Harrow or somewhere quite far, and they're looking to move towards Slough so they can fall within the catchment area." I don't think I think it's very unfair for you know s- just because you live in a certain area, you're not given that opportunity to get into a grammar school, and you have to move and change your life, get a new job. So that's why I think we should definitely end the ban on grammar schools. And coming from a grammar school myself, and I had friends which were in other schools. I mean, I can definitely say that there is a big difference between the quality of work and quality of teaching which takes place. And I'm not saying that state schools are bad and grammar schools are that's the only place you should go, but I think it's like motivation for other schools. Because when that happened towards Langley Grammar School, we had um we had Langley Academy next to us, so we were always in competition with those with that school. So we had school, kids from that. I had friends from that school. So what did you get in your test result? What did you get in your test result? And eventually it changed from Langley to Langley Academy, and I think that motivation actually came from Langley Grammar School because it allowed them to right, so this is what they've been ranked, so we want to get up there as well. So naturally, all the schools around that area look to better themselves.
That's really interesting. So the sort of I guess not to go down this sort of my own politics as a libertarian, but that is, I guess, sort of the argument behind competition. Because when you've got a sort of, I guess, free market education system, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the second half of this show, but I think that this idea that competition actually drives up standards in
Definitely,
other schools.
definitely.
So
This is
if you've
healthy
got,
competition, definitely.
yeah, exactly. So if you, this is the same sort of thing with, I guess, I don't know, a cake shop, a cake business. If a cake shop sets up in the lovely city of London and they start making really good scones and everybody loves those scones and everybody really wants to get in line for those scones, the other cake shops around the area are going to try and drive up their standards or alternatively decrease prices in order to increase the demand for their product. I think that that's interesting. Do you think that this commodification of education, this sort of thinking of education as a good, as something to be sold, as something that we can compete with, we can sort of let children compete for places at schools and sort of compete for this product, which is an education. Do you think that that's morally okay? Do you think that actually what we should have is just have really good schools across the board, or do you think that actually this competition is healthy?
No, I believe this competition is definitely healthy because just like with anything, it brings out the best in a person. It allows you to achieve your maximum potential. If everything is of the same level, you don't know where you stand. It's like, for example, when you go to uni, and anywhere, if you go to uni or if you apply for college, if you've only got 50 spaces, but you've got 100 students that are applying with all the same grades, how do you differentiate? So, having grammar schools in place, this obviously allows students to compete with each other. And, it's, I don't think that's morally wrong at all because it's allowing you to work harder than you thought you needed to work. And this is, it sets you up for life. We're not saying if you make it into a grammar school, this is it, you've made it in life. And I'm not saying if you don't make it into a grammar school, you're not going to get anywhere. That's looking at two extremes. So we should always encourage healthy competition wherever it may be, in whichever field, and definitely in the field of education. This allows the younger kids to flourish. Allows them to kind of spread their wings. Okay, look, I want to get the highest mark. I want to get the highest mark. Yeah, this is all healthy competition. So having grammar schools in place allows them, gives them the ability to do that, and it gives them the opportunity.
I completely agree with you. I just wanted to provide a little bit of balance without sort of being accused of being completely swayed one way. But I completely agree. I think that the primary criticism that grammar schools get is that grammar schools are sort of just there for sort of, I guess, middle class families that can afford the 11 plus tuition. But actually, I think what's interesting is with the ban on new grammar schools, which I think was put in place about 24 years ago, around the sort of Tony Blair, New Labour era of politics, but slightly before my time. I think that this is really interesting because it sort of speaks to this idea about education and actually what is the government's role in education entirely. Because we can sort of go down this ideological route and say, the government should stay out of education completely. Parents know what their children are capable of. Parents know their children best. And if we, let parents and let children and teachers have the freedom, I think this is key word, freedom in the education system to choose the education that's best for them, is that what really we need in the education system. But alternatively, I think one of the largest criticisms is what happens to those children whose parents don't care. I mean, a lot of parents will not care about their children's education, or maybe they can't. Maybe they're working a million hours a day, and so physically can't spend the time on their children. Do you think that's the responsibility of the government to solve? What do we do about those children that might be left behind by a sort of a comprehensive grammar school system across the country?
Reem, I believe, look, wherever there's a will, there's a way. So, I mean, even if I didn't come from a, very wealthy family. So my parents were working, but at the same time, there was always, discipline within the household. Look, this is the time where you have to sit down and, you've got to work. So in terms of, coming back to your question, if, whether I think sorry, could you say your question again?
Yeah, so do you think that it means that if we sort of implement a widespread grammar system across the country, that some children will be left behind? Maybe those that come.
Yeah, sorry. I personally, I don't feel it's the government's responsibility to, take care of all of the kids that, are being left behind, because it's a shared responsibility. Look, parent or the guardian, they have a responsibility not to only, you know, take care of the child for in terms of their health, their well-being, but also to, make sure they get a good education, make sure they're not neglected. So it has to come from both parties, not just the government or not just the parents. We have to work together. If we want a better future for the country, for everyone, for our children, it's got to come from both of us. Because now, when parents come to me and say, "Look, can you guarantee my child is going to pass?" I said, no one in the world can guarantee you that. It doesn't matter how good the teacher is or how good the tuition center is. I said, we can provide you everything in terms of resources that your child needs to pass. But then it comes down to you. How much effort are you going to put at home, with your child? What you're going to do with them. You have to put in some work at home. Or if you don't have time, maybe a sibling or an uncle or an auntie or the family, they've got to work something out. I think that's wrong to say it's only the government's responsibility to lift those kids out of that situation and provide for them.
As a libertarian, I have to say that's music to my ears. I think that it's never the government's responsibility entirely, and it's not just on a moral perspective, but I think actually the government tends to mess this stuff up all the time. So it's not just that I think it's not the government's responsibility to ensure that every single child has the most brilliant education that they can, but actually it speaks to a wider issue. The government can't. The government physically, historically, cannot do this. And I think that what we've seen at the moment is
Reem, and you've got to bear in mind, everyone's situation is different. So if you're going to put the responsibility on, one party and say, one party, they're responsible for all the shortcomings, you don't know the reasons for those shortcomings. So that's why I agree with you. The government can get it wrong and they often mess it up because you don't know the exact cause of why that child's maybe being neglected. So that's why it's got to be a shared responsibility.
And I think this is the issue with government policy in general, whether it be education or whether it be healthcare or sort of variety of other public sectors. This is an issue with government entirely because government looks at things on using a blanket approach. the national curriculum does not work for everyone, does not work for every child, because every child is completely different. And this is where we get into the sort of debate about school choice, because actually, if children and parents and teachers are able to cater the curriculum to their own child's needs or to their own class's needs, then what we should theoretically, at least, I think there have been some studies on this in the US where school choice has been implemented. Theoretically speaking, at least anyway, these children should see higher education outcomes because the education is directly catered to them. But I think this maybe speaks to a wider question about like the wider purpose of education, and I don't want to attempt to tackle that in this show because I think that's a slightly wider question. But if education's purpose is to, or school's purpose is to prepare students for their lives outside of school, do you think that the current system is failing?
Well, that all comes down to the schools again. So now there are certain schools. So obviously now speaking from experience, when I went to a grammar school, we used to have companies that used to come in, careers days, etc., where we used to get a lot of interaction with the companies and the employees that used to work there. And there were, I used to know some other children from, friends that didn't go to grammar schools and state schools. They didn't really have those links with those companies, and they weren't able to provide sort of a reality, what you expect once you leave education. So I do believe there is a lot of work to be done in that department, because often, even with the grammar school students, they achieve, amazing grades, they get A star, but then I feel sometimes they're lacking in the social side of things. It's because they've been so heavily invested into just books and, academic achievements. They've kind of neglected, so, and I also find that within this problem within the schools as well. They don't put that much pressure on the children to do physical activity, or go to clubs or sports, etc., teamwork. Bear in mind, when you join certain after school clubs or you play for a sports team, that also helps you mentally. It also, teaches you how to work with different children, how everyone's different, how you can obviously build relationships. So that's all important. I think that's a responsibility on the school. They need to make children realize the importance of this. And if you don't, the child will never, it may realize by itself, but most of the times they may not. And they think, okay, this is all I've got to do. I've just got to get amazing grades, get A stars, and then I'll make it in life. But, once you get beyond that, then you find out, hang on a second, I'm lacking in these skills, or had I done this, I would have learned, these kind of skills. So it really depends on the school as well. Again, it's wrong to say the governments, because bear in mind a lot of these schools are privately funded. So
yeah, I guess with the sort of new funding models, I don't know if you know much about this. I certainly don't. But it's sort of academies. I mean, they just sort of came out of nowhere, and I guess this is a separate aspect of school choice, where we're thinking about, grammar schools were a school choice. If we go back in history, I think about 50, 60 years ago, we had in the UK we had the tripartite education system, where essentially there used to be grammar schools, but there was also secondary modern schools and technical schools, and everyone took the 11 plus exam. Nobody didn't take it, everybody took it in the entire country, and then that decided what school you would go to post 11 or post 13, whenever your council decided you would take the exam. I think this is interesting because clearly the current system sort of fails on those soft skills, and I definitely found that to be the case going to LSE, which is I think it's now like third in the country for university league tables, but it certainly felt that way when it came to people around us that were sort of my different peers. I remember going to school and thinking, wow, like going to my first thinking, wow, like I'm really amazing. Like I got 2 A stars in A level. I'm brilliant. And then I meet different people in my first year of university, and they're all speaking Latin, and they're all sort of talking in this different bizarre language that I had never even heard of, and sort of discussing these ideas about talking about networking and spring week internships, and I just thought, oh my god, this is a completely completely different world. And I think it's these different skills that you learn. And so, sorry, to preface is those sort of students went to private schools. At private schools, you're taught these different soft skills, networking. I mean, especially in London, it's probably one of the most important things to do to get anywhere in life and sort of anywhere in your career. You've got to do these, networking and these soft skills, just actually being able to talk to people. These skills were not taught to me in my school, in my state school. So for me, going into my first year of university, it was a completely different kettle of fish. Do you think that it's schools' responsibility to teach teach students these soft skills in the long term?
Again, coming back to my point, I was what I'm finding as we're going further and further on is that there's less and less emphasis on tests and national tests, for example, SATs in year 6, even in year 9. Now, I don't think it's a major exam anymore, the year 9 SATs, or we actually used to prepare really hard for this. I remember now in year 7, 8, and 9, because these were national exams across the country. Everyone in year 9 had to do them. Now, I think what the government is doing, what I believe the government is doing, they're putting a lot of that responsibility on the school. Okay, look, you can do it, but they've got to be internal exams. So you have end of year exams for year 7, end of year exams for year 8. Now, the disadvantage with that is that if the quality of the teaching in that school is not that good, an end of year test for year 7 students may be of a very different level of difficulty to another school.
That's interesting. So I think that this sort of aspect of competition between different schools and the sort of difficulty around various different exams can actually have such a huge impact on these things. I just want to turn to. So I'm just going to turn to. I think it's this Ivan Dale, who wrote us a comment underneath the tweet. He said, "What about a failure in primary schools, meaning that you weren't able to consider grammar schools, but as you developed during high school, you'd have been intelligent enough to apply to grammar schools, but primary school didn't enable you to progress into these options." I think that's interesting because obviously we know that schools aren't able to. Primary schools don't necessarily encourage children to. Sort of get into apply for the 11 plus exam or to apply to these different schools. Actually, what ends up happening is they are able to sort of, these parents have got to go on their own initiative, and they've got to just decide themselves individually to get into these schools, to apply to the 11 plus exam, or to sort of have these conversations with their children about whether or not they think that they are potentially intelligent enough to do these things or to go on to a grammar school. But I think that's an interesting comment because just sort of like widely speaking in general, applying to grammar schools post the 11 plus exam used to be a thing when we had this tripartite education system. So if you started off going to a secondary modern school in say the 70s or 80s, you would have the option, I think when you turn 13 or 14, to then reapply to grammar schools if you felt as though you were intelligent enough to do so. I think what's interesting now is that these grammar schools are so sporadic in terms of where they're located in the country. At the moment, we only have about 163 grammar schools in England, and around 5% of secondary school pupils in England attend a grammar school, even though about 100,000 students sit the 11 plus exam every single year. So I think that's particularly interesting. Sabi, I know you've popped up. I've just invited you to speak again, but I don't know if that's going to work. But I think so. What's interesting now is sort of where these grammar schools are located, because we've got this ban on building new grammar schools. These like highly selective authorities are only around Bexley, Buckinghamshire, Kent, Lincolnshire, Medway, Slough, Southend-on-Sea, Sutton, Torbay, Trafford and Wirral. I just got the list there. But what's interesting about those areas is the majority of them are in the south of England. The majority of grammar schools are located in the south of England, which means that when we're thinking about this sort of levelling up government agenda that we've heard so much about, actually grammar schools potentially show that because they're located in these wealthier areas, Why don't we end this ban on new grammar schools, build these grammar schools in these areas where we know that there is unlocked potential, to quote our previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson, this sort of unlocked potential in these deprived areas. And we know that the sort of economic impact, economic weight of the north is significantly less than the south at the moment because of this inequality. I think that grammar schools sort of allow us to have this sort of equalizer.
Yeah, definitely. Because what happens is that what I believe the government, has done over the years is it's very easy to set up a grammar school next to another grammar school. And bear in mind, in Slough, where my tuition centre is, we've got literally two grammar schools opposite each other. Now, that's because once you make it a culture within an area, grammar schools is the thing. This is where you should be going. What happens is then it becomes a lot more competitive. I remember when I done the exam many years ago, um, there was X amount of students or X amount of students that were sitting the exam, and now over the years that number's doubled, tripled. So now how do you accommodate those students? You have to build more grammar schools, and you know, and that's what's happening now because what's ended up happening in Slough, these four grammar schools, you've got so many students that are applying for it. People are moving into the area. Now you've got more applicants, but you don't have that. You don't have more spaces. The schools, they physically cannot accommodate everyone. So what happens is this is why I believe it's good to have grammar schools around each area because in doing that, even though over the years there have been a lot more applicants for the 11 plus, the other schools have raised their standards. I've heard it so many times in the news, and again from experience, some of the schools in the area used to be really bad. Now they're all comparing themselves. Okay, look, I won't name any schools, but there was another school recently in the news which said we're on the same level as this grammar school, which was down the road. So I think it's like a benchmark. It's allowing the other schools to really say, right, we need to get on the standard of this school, and in term that makes the entire area almost better because you're looking up to something. It's almost like a role model. We need to get up to this level. Ofsted came in. What are they doing right? What are we doing wrong? You can compare yourself. So if you keep saturating one area, I mean, what's going to happen? Everyone's going to try and move there, and those areas are just going to get more and more deprived, and that shouldn't be happening because the government is responsible for the entire UK, not just the south of England. So that's something we need to consider.
Absolutely. So the conclusion from that statement, Sabi, is that freedom and competition in every sector, especially education, results in higher standards.
Higher standards, better quality. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, better quality of education and higher standards. Thank you, Sabi, for coming on the show today. That is Sabi Dean. He's the director of Think Smart Academy, and it was such a pleasure to hear from you today. Just before I let you go, should we build more grammar schools? Yes or no?
Definitely yes.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sabi. It was really, really interesting to talk to you.
Thank you, Reem.
Thank you. I think that what's interesting about this conversation around grammar schools is that we've sort of been talking about the way that the 11 plus exam works, where it comes from, the sort of different subjects that we see broken down within these exams. And I think it's interesting. So just those areas I listed, the Bexley, Buckinghamshire, Kent, Lincolnshire, Medway, Slough, Southend-on-Sea, Sutton, Torbury, Trafford and Wirral, these majoritively southern counties where there is such a high proportion of grammar schools. We know for a fact that a lot of these grammar schools do incredibly well in terms of their education outcomes, and a lot of those students end up going to some of the top universities. But I guess this speaks to a wider question: is that the sort of motivation behind education? Is the intention behind education to get your students to the best, most academically rigorous universities? Or is the purpose of education something more widely spoken about? We touched on that a little bit about sort of these soft skills that I feel as though I didn't learn until I got to university and I was surrounded by students who'd come from the top, most expensive private schools where they had learnt these soft skills actually, does this speak to a wider problem within the education system where we are pushing students too far and we're pushing them to achieve these academic sort of targets that we just have not seen before, and we don't know whether or not that's actually humanly feasible to get there across the country. I think this is where Tony Blair made a huge blunder when it came to education policy. He said, we need to get more people going to university, and I don't think that's really the right way forward in terms of education policy. I think that what we need to be doing is thinking about the sort of alternative routes post secondary school. And I think this is interesting, just sort of looking at grammar schools as a whole, where a lot of those grammar school students do end up going to university. Actually, would a lot of them been better off going to different sort of apprenticeships, or these sort of college courses, BTEC courses. There is so much variety now at the moment, and I think the government has been pushing this, sort of trying to upskill different areas of education. That, I think, to me, that's incredibly interesting, especially thinking about the history of that. Before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to talk about something that I was looking at whilst I was researching for today's show, which is East Germany and sort of the history of East Germany after communism had collapsed. And I think this is a really particular case where parents themselves asked for grammar schools. They wanted grammar schools. They wanted selective education. So after the fall of communism in Germany, especially Eastern Germany, parents genuinely asked for grammar schools. They went to their councils and they wanted grammar schools. And at the moment, Germany sort of prevails as having one of the best education systems in the world. They have school choice. They have grammar schools. I think they're called gymnasiums, and they are some of the best schools in Germany, purely due to the fact that they have the selective education system. And we're thinking about the long-term sort of consequences of a good education system is that we get this economic growth. We get a huge amount of highly skilled people in the labour market. And maybe that is what the aim of education should be. Having these highly skilled people in the British economy. I was talking about this today on GB News about Lord Wolfson, who's the head of Next, who said that he wanted more immigration in order for us to plug the labour shortage. And the guy that I was debating with had said that we actually should be focusing on upskilling, educating the British population, and that we failed in the British education system to upskill these people. I think that's interesting. I mean, I obviously, as a budding libertarian, I argued that immigration is a good thing and that businesses should be able to employ these workers from overseas. But why is it that we don't have these workers already within the British economy? Why haven't we been able to plug this labour shortage ourselves? Is it a result of the failing education system? Is it because we focus too much on academia and we haven't been able to fill these low-skilled jobs? I don't know. What is the solution to this issue? What is the sort of wider consequences of this grammar school system, or this broken grammar school system, considering the fact that we only have about 100,000 of our British students that are actually sitting the 11+ exam every year. Only 35 local authorities actually contain grammar schools. So I think that tells you something about the broken system that we have. And obviously the majority of them are in the south because, like everything in this country, it's concentrated in the south. Okay, I'm going to introduce our next wonderful guest. This is a lovely friend of mine as well, Jyoti Nag Chowdhury. I'm going to invite you to speak as well. Jyoti is a student at the London School of Economics as well as myself, and he's also on the Hayek Society Committee. So in case you guys don't know, Hayek was a economist in the 20th century who essentially focused on free markets, and he was part of the Austrian school. So free markets and free people are his sort of mantra, and it's a little bit more complicated than that. But the society that that Jyoti and I both run together is sort of based around these ideas of freedom. And I think that what attracted me to this idea of freedom in education is this idea of sort of grammar schools having sort of school choice in general. And it speaks to this idea that when we have school choice or just choice in general, we treat them as consumers in a labour market, sort of consumers within a education system. We think about the education system as a market itself, and we've got parents that are able to choose what kinds of schools their children go to. Actually, that drives up standards, and that's sort of the case across the board. So Hayek sort of spoke about this knowledge problem, and this is sort of one of his most famous ideas. I believe it's what he won his Nobel Prize for, but I might be wrong on that. I think that's what he won it for. And it's this idea that we use knowledge, sort of government can use knowledge to sort of try and create government policy, but it's a blanket approach, and that actually every single individual economic decision that occurs within an economy is completely individual, and there are so many different factors that go into it. And when we apply that to education, we end up coming to the conclusion that allowing parents and children and families to make these decisions themselves actually allows us to have a sort of free market education system that drives up standards. And I think that just from a liberal perspective, this ban on new grammar schools is completely and fundamentally illiberal. But what is this sort of idea around egalitarianism in the education system? Is that something that we should be striving for? So I think I've spoken at length about that conversation. But Jyoti, I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about your view on education, your view on grammar schools in general, and whether you think competition is something that we should try and get in our education system. I think that you are on mute, Jyoti, if you want to unmute yourself, and you will be able to enlighten us. Oh, I don't know if that's going to work, but that's okay. Jyoti did actually comment under one of those tweets and said that part of this would be expanding the availability of 12 to 13 plus late transfer, which some grammar schools do run. So children do develop at different rates, so it's imperative that this is an option. That being said, it's only possible with more places requiring more schools. So I think that it's clear that Jyoti is pro grammar schools and pro sort of lifting this illiberal ban, in my view, on new grammar schools. I think Jyoti's requested to speak. Let's accept. There we go. Hello, Jyoti. How are you?
Hello, is that working now?
Yes, I can hear
Good
you.
stuff.
How are you?
Yes, I'm doing well, thanks. Slightly horrified that you pronounced a scod as a scone, but other than that, it's great to be on. Yes.
I did indeed. Well, that is the correct way to
Is it
pronounce
really?
it.
Right. Wait,
Well, that's my view.
Ah, well.
I think the Queen actually used to pronounce it as scone. But I call it a scone, and that's what I'll call it
Well,
forever.
rather topical when we're getting on to grammar, with grammar schools. No, I hate to make it sound like an echo chamber, but I completely agree. That the ban on grammar schools represents probably one of the biggest systematic and policy failures to do with our education system in recent times. One that so much so, I believe you were mentioning how it the ban itself was brought in was it 1998? We may end up going a bit, back a bit further because there are one or two things I'd be quite interested to hear your opinion on when it comes to things such as direct grants, and I guess that also filters into school choice. But I'll get the quote, but it was along the lines of that that the way in which grammar schools have been decimated in the I've got it here. That the way in which comprehensives were introduced and grammar schools were abandoned was pretty close to academic vandalism. That's a quote from his autobiography. No, I agree entirely with that. And overall, whilst we'll get on to most of the arguments that have been brought up against grammar schools aren't really pertinent. In some cases, they actually would, in my opinion, argue the opposite when we get around to things such as you spoke about the 11 plus exam before, and late being able to join later, and also things to do with as you were just speaking about, the main reason as to why I believe that grammar schools are absolutely necessary in this country is because our education system as a whole, it's completely unoptimized. If we take independent schools out of the equation, I guess, for a second, if we look at the system that we have right now, you have some people, a fairly large number of people, who do want to go to university, but then ultimately that's also leaves a large number of the population who don't. And with this sort of comprehensive education system, neither group, whether you want to leave school and start working immediately or leave school and go to university, neither of them are going to have educational experiences that are optimized to them. And in the changing global economy, and especially to keep Britain's place, it is absolutely necessary that we do build an education system which is optimized for people who ultimately have different needs. This is also where it comes into with educational choice, which I'm sure we'll get onto. But that's the essential main part of my argument, that overall the limiting of school choice and in this instance has been an absolute travesty, and it is really nonsensical. And I think we need to unban schools as soon as possible. Frankly, that's essentially the main thing. I believe.
I completely agree. I think it's interesting. Just speaking about it from a sort of libertarian perspective, because I think in the first half of today's show, we were talking about the specifics around the 11 plus exam and the sort of specifics around the grammar school system in its current form and where we can make these improvements, actually building these schools across the country. But just sort of taking it from an ideological perspective, which I know it's sort of a political view that many of us share, and I see that with Mike Salem in the chat as well, who is also on the committee at the Hayek Society. So these sort of values of freedom and choice that have proven time and time again to be effective in driving up standards across various different public sectors, that includes education, or I guess especially education, because that is where I think that there is something so specific about education. When we're thinking about, I don't know, mobile phones, there are only so many different variations of a mobile phone that we can ascertain. But actually, when we're thinking about education, that is so specific to each different child, and every child works entirely differently. And unfortunately, I think as a result of the current sort of comprehensive, I mean, it really is comprehensive as in a blanket approach, dare I even say socialist education system that we have at the moment, where parents effectively have no choice. And in my view, I think that what we have at the moment is a vicious selection, essentially by parental wealth. If you live in the right area, if you live in the good area, then you are able to go to these good schools, and if you have enough money, then you can go to these private schools. And it's completely based on privileges, nothing to say about talent at all, unless you obviously live in these majority of these southern counties where there are still the remnants of some grammar schools. I think it's sort of grammar schools are like a historical artifact at this time because of the 24-year ban. But Georgie, I was wondering what you think. So do you think that choice in itself is a sort of a valuable thing to have, or do you think that choice just sort of actually genuinely does drive up standards in education?
Well, ultimately, this is one of the key parts to the argument, because I think that with those of us, especially, I think those of us who have, ideologies that we have convictions about, the
liberal persuasion.
Yes, but no, I think wherever you lie politically, but including where the kind of things that we believe in, it is a mix of philosophy and practice, and also what simply works out of well, as far as the data can show. But when it comes to things like choice, I can sometimes be a bit of a bit absolute on the fact that a lot of things are ultimately, yeah, one of the best things about living in ideally of living in a liberal democracy is liberty to make those choices for yourself. I do think that when it comes to there are Bessie, there are limits at some points where part of the reason as to why grammar schools have to exist is the fact that not everyone is fit for not everyone is necessarily cut out for a specific type of education. Not everybody is destined to say go into academia, and in that sense perhaps you could say it could always be averse to choice, but ultimately it's providing different options. And I think we can't solely look at choice in these situations. But I would certainly say that it's you do have the choice over whether to pursue this or not. I think in many of these areas, the number I've got down, did you say 35? So I was reading a article by Sir Graham Brady where, oh no, it wasn't Sir Graham Brady, it was Charlotte Martin, who mentioned that it was only 36 out of the 152 local authorities that contain a grammar school, and that is terrible. And another note of a deputy headmaster who was saying and funnily enough, one who disagreed with grammar schools, mentioned that there were children who were traveling 50 miles to go do their 11 plus, and this is absolutely avert to being to educational choice, because it's it is it is restricting the decision to. There is the part of luck, but also it is ultimately making it more elitist, in the sense that it becomes much less accessible for people because ultimately these areas are going to end up in a lot of cases being more expensive places to move to, since you'll be nearby or whatever. But ultimately, there's the geographical factor. There's also the fact that if we go back to the 11 plus, right? The threshold for getting into the schools, I might be corrected here, but it will be judged also based on the quality of the other candidates. And what you're likely to find is that you will get many students who are more than capable of keeping up with the pace of a grammar school, who really, for all intents and purposes, do have meet the academic threshold. If it was a flat number, obviously you can't do it as a flat number. That would be ridiculous. But because of maybe the strength of their intake or due to other factors, they may not be able to attend a grammar school because of this. And whilst they may have chances with the 12 plus or the 13 plus, which, may I add, is only done by some grammar schools, something which I also think should ideally change, but can only be possible with more grammar schools. It is a thing that failure to expand the system to more regional authorities, and also just having more places numerically is ultimately going to limit educational choice, which is incompatible with the notion of a free, democratic, United Kingdom, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think that grammar schools maybe speak, at least to me, as a first step in a wider sort of revolutionary reform that is required in the education system. And when we're thinking about these, I mean, some might call it slightly more radical, but these slightly more radical views about educational choice. And I think Milton Friedman said, I think I've actually got the quote. So Milton Friedman, who was another economist, famously of the 20th century, whose son, David Friedman, I actually met a few months ago. But Milton Friedman, who is a Chicago economist, said, in my ideal world, government would not be responsible for providing education any more than it is for providing food and clothing. Private charity would be more than ample to assure that there are schools available for every single child. So is this idea, I mean, I'm just wondering whether you agree with this, that grammar schools are a first step in this wider sort of idea around school choice, actually, do you believe that government should have no role in education at all?
I think it's a bit unrealistic to say that government should have no. I understand where the logic is coming from there, but at the same time, I guess I could see that if that was an end, that certainly bringing back grammar schools could be a first step. This is why I may, when I finish, answer this point. I was going to ask you about direct grants and what you thought about them. Yeah, the question I think would be certainly if that is the end that you were pursuing, then I do think that bringing grammar schools um, would be a step in that direction. However, my only question is that if the government plays absolutely no role in education, then as far as a just having people in state schools whatsoever, but secondly also being able to provide the vocational training that will ultimately equip people for jobs, whether or not they say want to go into university or apprenticeships, but especially for those of who may be for some reason or another maybe less well equipped or less inclined to go to university. How would we then go about providing that vocational training for these people? Would we do it solely through private corporations? Because whilst there are probably there are solutions that you could formulate with this idea. I'm just not sure if it's necessarily compatible. Well, not I'm not sure about how effective it would be, or if this is necessarily a desirable end. Because I would say that it is clear that the current government funding system is failing. I was actually in discussion with a because I actually called about an hour ago a deputy head of a state comprehensive school. I won't mention their name out of respect for them, but and they mentioned that whilst it's in a bad area, they're a relatively decently achieving in terms of university places. They've even had two Oxbridge students in their last intake, but she was saying how when it comes to say teaching, and when it comes to having people filling in, that with teacher absences, that they actually don't have enough money to then bring in anyone else or to pay for the cover. The funding isn't there, and what you'll end up happening is so what's had to end up happening at some points is where in one situation where the top set maths teacher had to take significant time out, they ended up in this like very crammed, almost lecture style lesson structure, which had the top set and the bottom set, simply because there was not the funding to do that. So, what I'm wondering is that whilst this system certainly isn't working, now knowing you, I feel relatively where your answer would be going. But would the remedy to this be other than the clear system change that is needed anyway, just to optimize teaching and modernize it? Because really, the system is archaic. Would it be better for the government to be putting more money into the school system, or do you think there should be an alternative when it comes to funding altogether? I was interested.
I think so. Yeah, I think the attempt with academies was essentially to increase the amount of sort of private charities, private organisations that are running these schools and allowing sort of a variety of different areas of funding to be included in these state schools. So the school that I went to, the sort of state comprehensive secondary school, ended up becoming an academy, I think, when I was in year 11. So because I left for sixth form, I went to a different sixth form college. Ironically, actually, my sixth form college was one that was also like selective, which meant that I was sort of, I didn't go to a grammar school, but I went to a selective sixth form. Anyway, I think that's interesting, sort of the different levels of selection across one's educational journey. I think that when it comes to funding, there definitely should be these different avenues for private organizations, private businesses to be able to put in their cash, because unfortunately, the taxpayer can only be stretched so much. And a lot of, I think what's interesting is a sort of inequality around taxation. Maybe this is something that we can think about in terms of the morality of taxation in general, but essentially, if you're a parent and you're paying taxes, you're getting some of that out of it, right? Because your children end up going to these schools, you get sort of the public good out of it. It's why the sort of argument around the NHS works in some ways, although I would, my views on the NHS, but it's why that argument works, because everybody that pays taxes is able to take out of it. But if you're somebody that doesn't have children, or never went to a school in this country, or never had family members or no connection to the education system, but your taxpayer money is still going to the education, to the state comprehensive education. So it's this question of whether we all pay in and we all get out is actually feasible, and whether or not these sort of private grants do actually work. Now, I'm going to play devil's advocate here. I guess the primary criticism of these like private organizations that end up putting funding into these schools, whether it be like sort of academies, or whether we sort of have a fully privatized education system where government has no business in it, and it's all based on the charitable status of these businesses or goods, whether or not that would then mean there are slightly different interests that are at hand. I mean, if you think that businesses do purely run for profit and do not care about necessarily the outcome of their services, whether or not you believe that that's the purpose of profit and that's the way that profit works in the first place, if you believe that, then this entire notion that private organizations, private individuals will be pumping money into state schools, that would be a completely abhorrent question, a completely abhorrent argument to make. Even though it might mean that there are alternative sources of funding. What do you think? Do you think that we should be allowing this to happen?
Well, the question, thing is ideally it could actually be, the main issue is the incentive here, because the ideal is that we can have a system which is built on, because ultimately, if the businesses are using their brains, then having investment into education, or putting investment into education, is actually something that can be thoroughly beneficial when it comes to, say, building rapport with the consumer, or just being able to train, have perhaps more hybrid schemes that mix this professional training with education, perhaps going further with that. I do have to admit that maybe I don't go as far as you do with this. When it comes to, can you remind me what it was that you asked me on what's happening, and if this is okay or not morally? Sorry.
So do you think that allowing private organizations to I guess top up funding that the taxpayer already provides is morally okay? Because essentially what that means, but wherever money goes, various different interests go with it. Just as an example, like political parties, obviously trade unions have a huge amount of funding in the Labour Party, which is why the Labour Party are always going to be somewhat soft on unions, even if it's not in their sort of ideological interest or political interest to do so. Same goes for the Conservative Party. A lot of the Conservative Party's funding comes from specific types of businesses, which then means ultimately their interests are taken into account. If you have the same thing happen to education, where you've got these private organizations that are pushing, sort of allowed to put this sort of private amount of money, and it's less regulated than it is now with sort of academies. If we're allowing these organizations to put money into state schools, their interests will ultimately be taken into account. And say, for example, we allow for a completely decentralized national curriculum, and a big old tobacco company comes along and funds part of a school where they can choose the sort of national curriculum entirely, potentially, their science lessons might include ideas about cigarettes not being as harmful as people say they are. I think
Oh
this is
my god,
maybe
lobbying in the classroom. This
lobbying
is
in the
brilliant.
classroom. Well, I think it's something
Get
to
them
think
while they're
about.
young.
Get them when they're young, not whilst they're in sort of the lobbies in Parliament, but get them whilst they're still children in the classroom.
Exactly. The grassroots lobbying.
Classroom lobbying. Well, I think that's
well, it's
potentially something we could always talk about.
It is. It does illustrate perhaps part of the difficulty with it. Funnily enough, I do think if you were trying to bring this policy forward in Parliament, you certainly would have some like absolutely livid Labour or Plaid Cymru MP bringing up that this is a genuine possibility, almost like sort of. It sounds like something Swiftian almost. But no. I think that when it comes to funding from private corporations, it just needs to be with their consent. Ultimately, if both parties get what they're going into, because ultimately, whilst it can just be altruistic, it's likely that you would get some of these companies that are getting involved would have some incentive. I think though, rather than that coming with an impact on the curriculum, because I'd actually, it's interesting to hear you say about the curriculum. I think some decentralization is okay, but for the most part, I guess we do need to appreciate that there are. I think there are a lot of ideas that need to be learned outside of the classroom, and that's the onus of the parents at home. But even if it just comes to providing insight or perhaps opportunities to for students to because ultimately it would be mutually beneficial for both the students and the business for these students to go and see what it's like to, because ultimately I feel as if when you are when you're at nursery and they're talking about jobs, it generally seems to be doctor or engineer, scientist. I'm not sure how many of them would have come up. I'm not sure how many of me would have loved to have come up to me and said, "Oh well, I would love to be a mergers and acquisition specialist at Goldman Sachs." Although to be fair, going to LSE, I wouldn't even be surprised.
Well, I mean, I wanted to be a princess when I grew up, and unfortunately, I think that might be somewhat out of reach for me. But I think it's interesting.
Oh yeah, I mean, I wanted to be a doctor, so you can imagine that when I just changed my mind and decided that I'm a conservative,
a doctor is a little bit more feasible.
When I told my very socialist mum that I am indeed a conservative, she wasn't exactly happy. But the fact is that overall, I think one thing that also comes into choice is knowledge, and is being able to understand the cards that really are there. And whilst we've gone quite far from grammar schools, I do think that it is crucial that students are informed of, because the fact is, I think the vast majority of jobs are ones that, even going into university, you probably wouldn't be very knowledgeable about. So even if it's not with the funding, I think overall, at least having some incentive for there to be more schemes and more training, even if it's just to develop soft skills or just to learn about careers more, that having some more corporate involvement within the education system isn't necessarily a bad thing, especially because when you look at the issues with, if I'm with the issues with the lack of funding and the lack of number of people going into teaching, ultimately, even if we do bring back grammar schools, these are issues that aren't necessarily going to magically go away. So we do need to look about them largely. And whilst even I'd say that perhaps what you're saying with Friedman, what Friedman was saying was it is a bit radical. Taking some principles from it could genuinely help with solving the critical errors that our education system faces. Because as somebody who has attended both a private independent school and a state school, a state comprehensive, the actual difference between like the standard of learning is tragic, and a lot of it is because of the fact that the comprehensive, the teachers are just not well equipped enough, and you can tell that they're not, then they themselves are not being given the support that they need. So whichever way we do it, it is very clear that our system is in need of fundamental change, from top to bottom, and perhaps it is time to look at um, some options that maybe we wouldn't have always considered before.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting when we're thinking about this wider conversation about school choice, and that's why grammar schools are so interesting to me. I mean, obviously, personally, I teach it myself, but there's this element of choice that I think is really interesting. So, I wrote a piece for the 1828 a few months ago about school vouchers. And I just wanted to, and we've really got about 10 minutes left till the end of the show, but I want to ask you about what do you think about these school vouchers? For those of you who don't know what school vouchers are, they're essentially something that Milton Friedman, again, my favourite guy, argued for. And it's essentially where the government allocates vouchers to families, and families are then able to top up these vouchers if they're financially able to, and it allows them the freedom to choose how their child is educated, whilst also ensuring that no child goes without an education. So it's sort of this idea about school choice, and government is there to fund education but not to administer education. This idea, and it was sort of trialed across certain areas of the United States. And I think that when we're thinking about the introduction of school choice, in supporting specialised education, so meaning that learning is tailored towards each child's specific needs, and not necessarily each child, but each sort of group of children. And I think that when we're thinking about in the long term, the impact of the pandemic on education mustn't be understated. And essentially, in the 1828 piece, I argued that if we allow for school choice and we allow this sort of voucher system to be implemented in the UK, then we will essentially alleviate a lot of these issues that are found within the education system, but also as a result of COVID. Because what we saw in COVID is we had 2 successive lockdowns. I was in my first year of university at the time, but I remember my 8-year-old sister, she's eight now, so beginning of lockdown, I think she was about 6, or she was about 5 or 6, and it had such a drastic impact. I think the SATs results that were released this year revealed that only about 59% of pupils met the expected level, which was down from 65% in 2019. So clearly, I think it's COVID is the primary factor here, had a huge impact. But allowing for school choice ultimately allows an improvement in the quality of education. We spoke a bit previously in the show about competition and the way that grammar schools and specialisation and sort of selective schools allow for the specialisation, and it targets the needs of students that have been left behind by these issues. So I guess my ultimate question to you, Georgie, is do you support school vouchers?
Well, I have to admit, as somebody, so while you were speaking, I honestly hadn't really read about this yet, but it's absolutely fascinating. And an interesting idea. Certainly, I think one thing that this would certainly provide. I may I say I'm still very much, as I'm speaking, formulating my opinion on this, but one thing that this definitely would provide is the kind of institutions that schools can, so that children can go to, especially to cater to what they in particular need. Because ultimately, we I think even regardless of whatever school you go to, whether it's you go to Eton or you go to, say, the newest underfunded state school that you might be nearest to, is that your what you require from education is going to be vastly different to other people's, and especially because your different strengths will vary in different places. Different areas are going to need more attention than others, and especially when it comes to, I suppose, formulating an education that's actually properly relevant to you. Especially, it's also interesting to look at the finances of this because it's built on the idea of how much money is saved by those who say attend private schools in the city of New York. So I'm looking at what Friedman said about this. I'm definitely when this space ends, I'm going to go and read more about this. But ultimately, when what your requirement is completely unique to you, having vouchers in order to have one that would best contribute to you as a as a whole human, to ultimately do what it is you want to do. Ideally, this would be a good thing. My only question to you is, and now this sounds really bad as somebody who champions freedom, but is there the issue where, especially when it comes to misinformed parents or students who may not necessarily know what's in their best interest, could this end up in a situation where you end up in a maybe lopsided or unsatisfactory education um, where ultimately you don't actually get everything you need to get, even if you don't necessarily know that? And the follow up is, since this is a system which is more, and I wouldn't say it's actually that much more elitist than our current system, because our current system is very. Honestly, I don't think it actually could get more elitist than it is right now, because we basically have because we basically have the dichotomy of independent or comprehensive, where the choice, unless you say go to a specialist school, it is there the issue that the problems that we have with elitism are not necessarily solved by this? And I have to say, I'm playing devil's advocate here, because in terms of asking you these, because I am going to read up on this, because this is genuinely quite an interesting idea.
No, it is. It's fascinating. I think that when I first heard about the voucher system, I thought that it was completely and utter bonkers.
When you first said it, I was thinking, what wacky thing is Reem bringing? no, but well, genuinely, it's genuinely quite fascinating. This.
I mean, yeah, that wouldn't be the first time I've been called a wacky libertarian by one of my peers. But I think that
that's part of it. That's how you know. That's how you know you're doing it right.
Yeah, exactly. If I've been called a wacky libertarian, then I've done something right. But I think what's interesting about this is, whilst we talk about free market systems and public services and rubbish collecting or whatever other wacky libertarians are completely obsessed with, when we're thinking about freedom and choice in education, it's already been trialed. It's been trialed across the United States, directly as a result of Milton Friedman's ideas being taken into account by various American politicians who've implemented these ideas. And I think that thinking about grammar schools as a whole, they can be opened up to various different backgrounds, quotas, and sort of lowering these different standards so that applicants can actually have this sort of opportunity. And it's essentially meritocracy selected on merit. It's true meritocracy, and it's a system that we just have. We had it for a while, and then we completely got rid of it under the Blair government. So I think it's interesting in the long term. If we think about educational reform, the government really should be taking this as an opportunity to reform the education system. And I think that these newer grammar schools should be located in disadvantaged areas, because we think about the north-south divide, or various areas in the south where we don't have these grammar schools. It means that those children don't have the opportunity to practice for the 11 plus or do the 11 plus exam at all. And it means that we've got essentially this generational opportunity to restore meritocracy in our school system has not been taken. I think the government shouldn't hesitate to take it. But I think that just to sort of on that first question about choice in general, I think it means that we're driving up these standards because we have this competition. This, I think, grammar schools is sort of a first step towards a fully free system. And by free, I mean where parents and children know their education better, and parents and teachers know their education better, and they're able to make those individual decisions themselves. I hope that answers your question.
Certainly. And does that bring us to a close then, or do we have any further
It
questions that we'd
it
like
does.
to
I
discuss?
think. I mean, I don't know if anybody else listening has any questions. Just to conclude,
Hmm.
but I think that we quite possibly will leave it there. I'm just going to ask you finally. I think I know where you stand on this, Jyoti, but do you think that we should end the ban on new grammar schools?
Absolutely. I think the sooner we do it, the better. And it's ultimately one step to revamping the school system, which is completely necessary, and also expanding educational choice. And also, aside from if I'm to completely remove, like, say, what I ideologically believe in, the statistics don't lie. The ban on grammar schools and overall the overhaul in education since um, since the since Circular 1065 and the Education Act of 76, it has been a tragedy, really, as far as the school system is concerned. And I think for us to get back on the right track from this crisis that we find ourselves in, it's absolutely imperative that we bring back grammar schools and we have a proper reevaluation of what we want to of the kind of um or the kind of upbringing our younger brothers and sisters, our children, our grandchildren will have. And the first step of that will certainly be to remove this ban. And thank you so much for having me on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Jyoti. I love that bit about evidence. It reminded me of the Ben Shapiro facts don't care
Oh
about your
God!
feelings.
Don't make
Sort of
don't
thing.
make that comparison.
Well, I think it was a helpful comparison because it means that actually, whilst we can have these ideological conversations about the merits of freedom and choice, actually it does work, and it's proved that it works. So thank you so much, Jyoti. That's
Thank you.
Jyoti Nag Chaudhary, who is a student at the London School of Economics and also on the Hayek Society Committee at LSE. Thank you so much to everybody for listening. That was my first ever show, so it was really wonderful to take some of your comments and listen to my guests to have this conversation. So, I mean, I don't know what you guys think. Do you think that we should end the ban on new grammar schools? Is the education system broken? What do you guys think? I'd love to hear all of your views. But thank you so much to everyone. I hope you'll have a lovely evening, and we'll be pondering this question about grammar schools and the future of grammar schools, I think, for quite a while. Thank you, everyone. Good night.